We all know sustainability isn't a one-shot espresso, it's a transition journey. From grounds for change to net zero nitro, today we're diving into real-world experiences of making decarbonisation work. I'm joined by Devika Parbhoesingh from Haskoning and Andy Yap from Climate Smart Ventures for coffee and a conversation on sustainability implementation experiences with a focus on energy and industrial transition. What are the key drivers for transition projects in Asia today?
Basically, I would say there are three key things. One would be the policy drivers. The second would be very much I would say a concessionary environment to encourage transition. And the third would be obviously the economics. So on the first point on policy, definitely a strong stance where there is an incentive or conversely a disincentive that would definitely drive transition conversations. Just for context, for example, in Malaysia and Philippines, there's already been some new coal moratorium in place. There's also been strong green energy auction programs. In fact, in Philippines, we had one recently for 25 gigawatts of green auction. To put in context, that could be enough to power up to maybe 10 to 15 million homes or households comfortably. So these are really big policy commitments and initiatives which can drive the market. On the concessionary environment, typically one where there is an ecosystem of good-natured philanthropies, multi-development banks in the mix, then that will also encourage transition conversations, such as in the Asian Development Bank, they have a ETM program or Energy Transition Mechanism. As well as Singapore, there is the FAST-P program, which is Financing Asia's Transition Program. So these are good, sound initiatives blended with obviously financial structures to encourage the transition. So that's a key second driver. I would say the third is then obviously the economics of things. As per most corporates, the numbers do matter. But the good news is the renewable energy pricing or cost have come down drastically. For example, even in battery storage, we are always making new all-time lows in terms of the production cost, so that's great signaling. In fact, even in Asia, if you look at most of the recent statistics, the new renewable energy infrastructure are really operating at much more efficient numbers, both from a cost as well as a utilization rate with regards to fossil fuels. So these are very strong, good drivers to sort of instill more conversations.
Yeah, and I think also adding to that, especially for the manufacturing industry, also the energy prices went up extremely, and there's also a lot of price volatility. So you would say it helps to get your business case also in more towards the positive side. So yeah, I think, and on top of that, also, there's a growing demand from international buyers of those industries to reduce footprints. But I think in general, sustainability isn't anymore just about being sustainable. It's about how can I increase competitiveness, how can I maintain my contracts, how can I keep satisfying my clients, and while I am increasing my sustainability performance. So it's shifting towards that.
Okay. Devika, from your experience, what really separates transition projects that move ahead from those that quietly stall along the way?
Yeah, I think that's a good one. If we look at the manufacturing companies, multinational companies, plant ownership, local plant ownership is very important. So local sites should really own what needs to be done, and especially when it comes to top-down corporate plans and sustainability targets, ambitions, what does that exactly mean for a plant and for a site, and do they stand behind those plans? Because eventually they will need to pay for it as well. They need to have the financial resources and they need to be willing to invest. And it helps if at least this alignment takes place. I think this is a good starting point to move ahead in the journey.
Okay, so Andy, it's less about technology and more about leadership and alignment across stakeholders?
Yeah, so I'll add to that. I think having an internal champion within the organization, preferably someone senior, is going to be very important as a transition driver. and perhaps to my earlier point, enabling conditions with policy support, with a concessionary environment, those are very constructive. But maybe last but not least, a more, I would say, clear narrative or clear articulation of these projects, even if it's going to be in bite-size or phases, that will help the overall bankability proposition. And that's something we also are very keen to help explore or unpack it for investors.
Okay. We often talk about ambition, but implementation is where it gets real. What are grounds for change inside organizations?
Yeah, so coming back to the policy topic, I think usually a policy headwind, if I may use the word, is a good trigger for corporates to really implement improvements or operationalize sustainability. That could be in the form of a carbon tax, a CBAM mechanism. Interestingly, a lot of corporates have not really priced in some of these externalities, but when they realize that they're not far away from the deadlines, they start sort of panicking, or they start to say, oh, I really need to do something. So like it or not, the regulations actually do help to steer, I would say, operationalization on the ground. But also, importantly, I think to my earlier point, having the internal champion or sometimes a change of leadership, particularly where a younger leader might surface, or it could be an incumbent leader with epiphany suddenly to say, sustainability is helpful for me strategically in the long run. So I think some of these conversations are typically what we see in having sustainability on the ground.
Okay. Actual implementation is often more of a slow brew than a quick shot. Yep. Where do companies usually face the biggest bottlenecks when they move from plans to execution?
So personally, I think a lot of times the initial transition or just like any change management behavior requires a substantial amount of adjustments. So in the context of transitions, typically that would culminate in a big initial capex, or at least the awareness that on the short term the OPEX might be higher. And that can be quite intimidating for a lot of decision makers. Notwithstanding there are already bankable solutions, there could be creative ways of, I would say, easing the initial high stakes, but nonetheless it's still a big number and it's still a big change behavior. So that's one we often see. And the other one could also be sometimes on the policy side again, perhaps a rollback of policy. Like for example, if there could be a requirement that is pro-sustainability, but then that gets delayed in terms of implementation at the policy level, then that in a sense makes decision makers a bit hesitant. Are they jumping ahead of the curve as much as they don't want to be behind? Yeah. So these are some of the things that we see.
Okay. Devika, what is harder in practice, setting decarbonization goals or translating them into day-to-day operational decisions?
I think definitely the last one, because you have to include maintenance, routines, operational KPIs, challenges, all kinds of safety-related issues, local regulations, so on plant level. So it's very easy to set a target, but really to translate it to day-to-day operations is where actually the work begins. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just add to that analogy I always say is that when you put a GPS, the destination is easy, right? It's a one-time thingy. But when you start to drive the car, especially if it's a rented car on a holiday, you don't know whether you get a punctured tire, you don't know where is the nearest petrol kiosk, right? You're not familiar with the traffic rules, so yeah, just to echo that. Yeah.
In Singapore, MRT, that's the easiest and the best.
Yeah.
Andy, how critical is sequencing? Starting with efficiency, then fuel switching, then renewables, rather than trying to do everything at once?
Yeah, absolutely. Sequencing is essential. I think the energy conversation has to be always a mix or balance with lives and livelihoods. So when I refer to that, if you look at an overnight change in any technology, especially when you're dealing with energy, you're risking, intermittency. You're risking blackouts. So people's lives could be impacted. More importantly, livelihoods could also be impacted. I mean, if you're looking at a big transition from coal, for example, to a renewable energy environment, is the workforce equipped for that? would that lead to job losses in the short term? So these are very dicey subjects, and naturally, it's important to navigate it carefully. Yeah.
And where do you see companies getting this wrong, the sequencing?
Yeah, I think that again, it's a matter of rationalizing what are the low-hanging fruits, what could create quick returns, shorter payback periods, if I may, and then having those conversations with the right advisors or partners. So for us, we're passionate about helping corporates to rationalize that. So I think where they might get it wrong is just the initial thought that, or the initial hesitation that the change is going to be big, and because of that, they don't do it. Or they are looking for perfection, for example. So I think that the key idea is just to really phase it out, be wise about what can be done, find good partners, and good policy support to augment the entire transition.
Okay, great to see that you're passionate about it. I know one of Devika's passions is Scope 1 and 2. Those can already be complex for industry, but Scope 3, Devika, where things really expand. What are the key challenges there for industry when it comes to Scope 3 implementation in Asia?
Yeah, so Scope 3 emission reductions is what we talk about, is let's say, we know that supply chains are very fragmented, and that also data is limited when it comes to transparency about the Scope 3 emissions. Of course, it's easier said than done, because you have to gather quite confidential information about how a purchased good is produced. So, for example, you have to disclose formulas or the way it's being produced, and not many manufacturers want to disclose that, of course, so that's still a challenge to get that done. But what you do see is that Europe is currently developing this digital product passport initiative, so that could be a first start to at least understand the current baseline of the Scope 3 emissions, and from there start to think about, okay, what can be done to then reduce it, what needs to be done, why and where and when and with whom. So before we start to solve things, I think it's important to really have a clear baseline. But before we get there, you first should solve the data transparency issue in the Scope 3 value chain.
Okay. And you already mentioned regulations and policies. How do policy uncertainty, energy pricing and supply chains influence transition decisions in this region?
Yeah, so I think particularly energy pricing, obviously with the recent turmoil globally, the question is then energy security. And even within that space, would a transition away from coal, for example, to gas, is that obviously is a viable option, but gas is also subject to, for example, transportation noises. So again, maybe compared to a renewable, independent, direct at source power supply, that could be a trade-off to weigh. So I think energy security has come to the front. Energy transition within that space, which is the right technology, that's also very key. But interestingly, there's also contractual agreements a lot of times when we look at energy pricing. Long-term PPAs, for example, may prohibit an early transition as well. And also, to some extent, I think even infrastructure may not be ready, right? If you want to move to renewables or gas, maybe possible in a siloed manner, but if you're looking at a systemic kind of a rollout, you do need the pipes, the infrastructure, the cables to be all in place. Yeah.
Okay. Why is it still so difficult to translate technically sound decarbonization solutions into investable, bankable projects?
Yeah, so I think similar to my earlier point, I think, and as you alluded to, there could be a problem with sequencing. There could be a problem with just being intimidated by the initial capex or opex. But also, I think what could be an impediment is just not knowing what's available out there. Very often there are instruments out there. Technically, as we know, and Haskoning does a lot of that, technically these are feasible, but and in fact financially it's possible, but the corporates may not be aware of what's out there, especially on the concessionary side. There are development banks keen to support as well if the sizing and the structure is right. There could be also interested commercial off-takers that may be willing to invest themselves. For example, like a build, lease, and then build and lease kind of a regime. So I think, fortunately or fortunately, the good news is that the willingness is there, the technology is there, the finance should be there, but it's a matter of knowing where to find this and who can help them. Yeah.
And for engineers and sustainability teams, do they underestimate then the engagement with the financiers? Is that their challenge?
No, actually I think that is quite a well-established work stream. Like for example, Haskoning could be doing the technical feasibility, we do the financial feasibility and due diligence, but it's going to be very collaborative, and a lot of these pathways have already been established by, I would say, maybe in the developed markets, we have already real-life case studies, so it's not entirely new. There's precedents we could rely on and just tweak it to our local context.
Okay, very good. In energy-intensive sectors with tight margins, what implementation and investment strategies are the most effective?
Yeah, so again, I think always important to look at the contractual PPAs, the contractual flexibilities that allow you to bring in blended finance, looking at the stack of capital that is available and knowing who would be best right to structure it. And then importantly, working with the technology solution provider or the advisor. So very often, I think the phasing in, the sequencing themes that we have talked about are very relevant to make sure that we're not looking at large scale or one-time big shifts, but bite-sized, quick payback kind of returns. And that in itself is an ongoing, iterative, fruitful process.
Okay, and for your clients, how important is it that decarbonization projects also improve cost efficiency and operational resilience and not just reduce emission?
Yeah, that's absolutely it. I mean, they're both joined at the hip. In fact, I would say that the latter is more important, and then sometimes sustainability, if it could be achieved, would be a great plus. It's becoming more and more imperative for sure, but the reality is that the economics must make sense first of all, and that's what we truly believe at CSV. We believe that the commercial climate solutions are viable today. It's more a matter of awareness, more a matter of partnerships.
Okay, so it's viable and you're aware of things, so maybe you can both share an example of a successful transition project and what made it work in practice?
Yeah, so for example, we worked for a major brewery and we had like multiple sites across the globe, and they had like decarbonization roadmaps for each site. And there was one specific site where there were extremely high energy prices, and there was a very also large volatility in the prices. So we came up with, of course, a change in the utility asset configuration. And that requires investments, but on the other hand, also on-site renewable energy generation, which is also quite a big capex project. But the business case was very positive because of those high costs. So this company was quite open to explore external financial resources. So they partnered up with an investor and they, let's say, invested in a renewable energy generation project, and then they paid themselves for changing their utility asset configurations. And together, that was a successful implementation, but it really was because they were open to explore external financial resources, and also, you have to think a little bit in a creative way on how to get there. And it helped that the costs were very high at that point. So you also help the day-to-day operations in operating there and to remain competitive in the market. So. Okay,
and do you also have a good example?
Yes, one of the notable support that we gave was to a energy company, ASEN in the Philippines. So we were honored to be able to offer some financial advisory around that structure. Essentially, the company had a commitment to phase out its coal assets by 2040. So this was back in the late 2022. But also they had an asset, specifically was called an SL Tech asset. It had a technical life up to 2055. So the challenge was how could they early retire the plant. But they successfully were able to do that. Obviously, we supported the process. Essentially, they were able to do a refinancing with the help of 2 local banks. So that was on the debt side to get attractive local financing. But also there was also equity ownership from 2 life insurers, if I recall. So in a sense, that was a good blended finance structure. it not only allowed them to be NPV positive by shaving off 15 years, but more importantly, it gave them as well additional cash to scale renewables, which is then the other side of the story that must go hand in hand. So that is a great example, I would say. And that in itself also has spillovers. I think where we are seeing that now is this project is also going to be on the transition credits initiative. And that in itself, to my earlier point, has a policy, has a partnership perspective. What do I mean by that? For example, MAS has a very clear taxonomy with regards to co-transition. It has also, in fact, a carbon credit program called Traction. So this same asset will should now be able to generate transition credits in the near future. So again, that is an additional revenue stream to encourage further phasing out of coal plants. So in that regard, for that same asset, we're looking at another 10 years of early retirement being compensated through this mechanism. So again, there are that policy environment that we need to be aware of to lobby support from the decision makers. But also there has been very good intention philanthropies who have been helping. Rockefeller, they were very much involved in the MES transition program as well. So again, coming back, there are examples there, and we'll be happy to also help clients to navigate it.
Okay, and how transferable are these lessons across sectors in industry?
Yeah, so what I said, the creative ways of getting external financing is definitely something that more industries could do. At the same time, the data element, also having your data in place regarding your energy use, for example, will help a lot. So yeah, all that together can really contribute to also other sites and other companies. Yeah.
Yeah. So definitely very transferable. I think fundamentally, so long as the technical, the financials make sense, then the tools are available. And I think suffice to say, if a coal plant could be early retired, and that's probably one of the most challenging problem statements in the region, then it should apply to many other sectors as well. It should be easier, I would say. Yeah.
Okay. Final question: what developments in industrial decarbonization are you most cautiously optimistic about?
Yeah, I think personally, I would say industrial clusters or industrial parks. I think even globally, to the tune of 10,000 of these facility type, large-scale facilities are already present. And there generates substantial economies of scale, whether it is in terms of having a common grid, having a common infrastructure play. If it's something more nascent like CCUS, you could do a hub for the industrial park rather than a siloed asset. So I'm cautiously optimistic in that regard, that there will be policy support around it. There will be better understanding by investors on the risk, and consequently there will be the financing available here.
Yeah, and I think also the growing awareness on plant level is really something I see changing. So they start to see that decarbonization and defossilization can actually contribute to their overall performance. And that's, I think, that mindset change will really help. So that makes me optimistic also about the future.
Devika and Andy, thank you very much for sharing these insights, practical experiences, and optimism about future developments. So hang in there, it will all be in scope soon.